The Galactic Council chamber was huge with tall ceilings and strange lights that changed colors as they moved across the walls. William Carter stood at the entrance and took a deep breath. As Earth's first ambassador to the stars, he knew this moment would go down in human history. The room held over 200 alien representatives from across the galaxy. Some looked almost human with 2 arms and legs. Others were completely different with multiple limbs or floating bodies made of gas. Carter straightened his blue diplomatic uniform and walked forward as his name was announced. Representing Earth and the Human Systems Alliance, Ambassador William. Carter, called out a translator device. Carter walked slowly down the center aisle. He felt hundreds of alien eyes watching his every move. Some aliens whispered to each other. Others made clicking or humming sounds that their translation devices couldn't quite catch. After years of preparation and months of space travel, humanity was finally joining the galactic community. At the end of the aisle stood High Commander Vexler of the Zarkonian Empire. The tall alien had blue-gray skin with small ridges along the sides of his face. His military uniform showed many medals and honors. The Zarkonians were one of the oldest and most powerful species in the Council. Their support had been key to getting humans invited so quickly after first contact. Ambassador Carter, Vexler said with a small bow, the Council welcomes Earth to our galactic family. Your species has shown remarkable progress in such a short evolutionary period. Carter bowed back as he had been taught. Thank you, High Commander. We are honored to join the Council and learn from your wisdom. The formal ceremony lasted 2 hours. Carter signed treaties and agreements while aliens from across the galaxy watched. When it was done, servants opened the large doors to a reception hall where food and drinks from 100 worlds waited on long tables. You must be tired after all that standing, said a small green alien who approached Carter. I am Caleth of the Phrygian Science Academy. We are most interested in human biology and culture. Carter smiled at the mantis-like alien. A pleasure to meet you. And yes, my feet are killing me, but I wouldn't miss this for the world. Caleth tilted his head. Killing you? Your feet are weapons? Just a figure of speech, Carter explained. Humans use a lot of expressions that aren't meant to be taken literally. More aliens joined their conversation. A tall female with purple skin introduced herself as Ambassador Lyra from the Moxim Confederation. A round floating alien called itself Speaker Orb from the Collective of Thought. Soon Carter found himself surrounded by curious representatives, asking questions about Earth. Is it true humans only live for around 100 cycles? Asked Lyra. Yes, our average lifespan is about 80 to 90 years, though some live past 100, Carter answered. Fascinating, Caleth said. So brief, yet you've accomplished so much. The conversation shifted to human history and culture. Carter explained Earth's many nations and languages. He talked about human art and music. The aliens seemed especially interested in human wars and conflicts. Your species has fought many wars against itself? Commander Vexler asked as he joined the group. Carter nodded. Unfortunately, yes. Human history has many dark chapters of violence, but we've learned from our mistakes. We haven't had a world war in over a century. Tell us about your warriors, Vexler said. We've studied some of your military history. It seems filled with exaggerations. What do you mean? Carter asked. Caleth made a chirping sound that might have been a laugh. Your historical accounts speak of impossible events. 300 warriors holding off an army of thousands. Single soldiers defeating dozens of enemies. Surely these are myths to inspire your young? Carter smiled. Some details might be enhanced over time, but many of those stories have truth at their core. The 300 Spartans at Thermopylae really did hold off a massive Persian army. Even if the exact numbers might be debated, such claims are common among young species, Vexler said. His tone was not unkind but had a hint of condescension. When the Zarkonian Empire was young, we too had tales of impossible military feats. As we matured, we learned to document our history more accurately. Other aliens nodded in agreement. Carter realized they thought humans were simply an immature species with childish myths about their capabilities. "We Zarkonians record our military campaigns with precise detail," Vexler continued. "Every victory and defeat is documented without embellishment. To do otherwise would dishonor those who fought." "I understand," Carter said carefully. "Different cultures have different approaches to recording history. Humans often focus on the emotional and inspirational aspects of events." "A fascinating psychological insight," Caleth said. "Your species seems to need these embellished tales of glory and sacrifice. Perhaps it's a coping mechanism for your brief lifespans." Carter kept his diplomatic smile in place even as he felt a flash of irritation. "Perhaps there's more truth to our stories than you realize." A soft chime sounded, indicating the reception was moving to its next phase. Servers brought out new dishes representing Earth cuisine. The aliens moved away to sample the human foods, leaving Carter alone for a moment. He watched the diverse group of beings. Some had evolved on water worlds, others on planets with crushing gravity or toxic atmospheres. Each species had its own history and perspective. Carter knew that humans were newcomers here with much to prove. The other species clearly saw humanity as an interesting but primitive addition to their ranks. As Carter moved through the crowd, he overheard more conversations about human myths and exaggerations. The aliens found human history entertaining but didn't take it seriously. He made a mental note to discuss this with his superiors back on Earth. The aliens' dismissive attitude toward human capabilities might actually be an advantage in future negotiations. For now, Carter would let them believe what they wanted about humanity's past and potential. The truth would reveal itself in time. He glanced at his communication device and saw a message from Earth Command. Captain Samuel Wright had been selected as the military liaison to the Galactic Council and would arrive within 3 months. Carter smiled to himself. The aliens thought human war stories were myths. They had no idea what was coming. Captain Wright wasn't just any officer. He was the hero of Outpost Delta 7, a man who had lived through one of those impossible last stands that the aliens found so amusing. Perhaps it was time for the Galactic Council to learn that some myths were based on terrifying truths. 3 months passed quickly at the Galactic Hub Station. Ambassador Carter settled into his new role among the alien representatives. Humans were still a novelty to most species. Some were friendly and curious, while others kept their distance. The Zarkonians watched humans with special interest. High Commander Vexler often invited Carter to diplomatic events where he would ask detailed questions about Earth's military and defense systems. Carter answered carefully, each time without revealing too much. The day Captain Samuel Wright was scheduled to arrive, Carter woke up early. He checked his appearance in the mirror and straightened his uniform. Wright wasn't just any officer. He was a legend in the Human Systems Alliance. The hero of Outpost Delta 7, a man who had faced the kind of battle that the aliens thought only existed in human myths. Carter had never met Wright in person before, but everyone on Earth knew his story. Carter waited at the docking bay as the human transport ship connected to the station. The airlock doors opened with a soft hiss. A tall man in a Navy uniform stepped through. Captain Samuel Wright looked different from his official photos. He was thinner with deep lines on his face. A long scar ran from his left temple down to his jaw. His eyes were alert and missed nothing as he scanned the docking area. "Captain Wright," Carter stepped forward with his hand extended. "Welcome to Galactic Hub. I'm Ambassador Carter." Wright shook his hand with a firm grip. "Ambassador, thank you for the welcome." His voice was quiet and rough, as if he didn't use it often. "How was your journey?" Carter asked as they walked toward the human quarters. "Long," Wright said. "I'm not fond of space travel." He carried a single small bag over his shoulder. Everything about him was minimal and efficient. Carter gave Wright a quick tour of the human section of the station. "The aliens are very interested in meeting you. Word has spread that a human military hero is joining our delegation." Wright frowned slightly. "I'm not here for publicity, Ambassador. I'm here to assess security protocols and establish military cooperation channels." "Of course," Carter nodded. But diplomatic relations include social functions. There's a gathering tonight with representatives from the Security Council. Your presence would be valuable. Wright didn't look pleased, but he nodded. I'll attend. That evening, the reception hall was filled with aliens from the most powerful military species in the galaxy. The Zarkonians dominated the room with their tall blue-gray forms and decorated uniforms. The insect-like Phrygians clustered near the food tables. The massive Dovan warriors stood by the walls, their thick arms crossed over armored chests. When Carter entered with Captain Wright, conversations paused. Alien eyes turned to study the newcomer. Wright wore his formal Navy uniform with rows of medals and ribbons across his chest. He stood straight and still under their gaze. Ambassador Carter, Commander Vexler approached them. This must be the military liaison we've heard about. Yes, High Commander. May I present Captain Samuel Wright of the Human Systems Alliance Navy? Wright gave a small bow as was customary. Commander Vexler, it's an honor to meet a leader of your reputation. Vexler studied Wright with interest. The honor is mine, Captain. We've heard you are a distinguished warrior among your people. More aliens gathered around them. Kaleth from the Phrygian Science Academy pushed forward. Captain Wright, is it true you participated in the conflict with the Krull insurgents? Wright's face remained neutral. I served during that time, yes. The aliens exchanged glances. The Krull were a violent species from the Outer Rim that had attacked several human colonies before being defeated. The conflict had been humanity's first real interstellar war. We were just discussing human military history with Ambassador Carter last week, Kaleth continued. Your species has many fascinating stories of battle, though some seem quite exaggerated. Right. Raised an eyebrow but said nothing. Commander Vexler nodded. Indeed. Humans seem to enjoy tales of small forces defeating much larger enemies, or single warriors accomplishing impossible feats. Our historical records show that such scenarios are statistically impossible, added a Dovan warrior named Gron. Species can overcome such numerical disadvantages without technological superiority. Carter watched Wright carefully. The captain's expression hadn't changed, but Carter noticed his posture had stiffened slightly. With respect, Commander, Wright spoke for the first time in several minutes, his voice steady and low. Sometimes the truth is more incredible than any myth. The room grew quieter. The alien sensed something had shifted in the conversation. Captain, Wright has extensive combat experience, Carter explained carefully. Perhaps at another time he could share some insights about human military doctrine. I would be most interested, Commander Vexler said. The Zarkonian Empire has 8,000 years of documented warfare. We value the exchange of military knowledge. Wright looked at Vexler with those intense eyes of his. Knowledge is valuable, Commander. Experience is something else entirely. The alien seemed both confused and intrigued by Wright's words. Kaleth tilted his insect head. Are you suggesting your personal experiences contradict established military science, Captain? I'm suggesting that different species fight differently, Wright said. And humans fight in ways you might not understand. A tension filled the air. Carter stepped in quickly. Captain Wright has only just arrived. Perhaps we should allow him time to settle in before detailed discussions. But Commander Vexler was too interested to let the subject drop. Captain, would you be willing to address the Security Council tomorrow? A formal exchange of military perspectives would benefit all parties. Wright looked at Carter, who gave a small nod. This wasn't in the planned schedule, but it could be an opportunity to gain respect among the alien military leaders. I would be honored, Commander, Wright said. Though I should warn you that human warfare isn't always comfortable to discuss. We are warriors, Captain, Vexler said proudly. We do not shy from the realities of combat. Wright almost smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. Very well, tomorrow then. As the reception continued, Wright spoke little. He observed the aliens and answered direct questions with minimal words. Many alien representatives tried to engage him about his service record or the medals he wore. But Wright deflected their questions politely. Later that night, As Carter walked right back to his quarters, he asked, "What do you plan to tell them tomorrow?" Wright was quiet for a long moment. "The truth, Ambassador. They think our history is full of myths and exaggerations. They need to understand what they're dealing with." "Be diplomatic, Captain. We're still establishing our position here." Wright stopped and looked at Carter. "They invited a soldier, not a diplomat. They want to hear about human warfare. I'll tell them exactly what happens when humans are backed into a corner. They might not sleep well afterward, but they'll never doubt our resolve again." Carter watched Wright enter his quarters and felt a chill run down his spine. Tomorrow would change how the aliens viewed humanity forever. The Security Council chamber was larger than the main reception hall and designed to intimidate visitors. Curved rows of seats rose up like a giant bowl with the speaker's platform in the center. Representatives from 27 different species filled the seats. Some wore military uniforms while others dressed in formal diplomatic attire. Ambassador Carter sat in the human section feeling nervous about what Captain Wright might say. The captain stood calmly at the center platform looking up at the alien faces studying him. Wright wore his formal Navy uniform but had removed some of the medals and ribbons from the night before. He looked professional but less decorated. High Commander Vexler spoke from his elevated position at the head of the council. "This emergency session of the Security Council welcomes Captain Samuel Wright of Earth. He has agreed to share insights on human military doctrine and history. As a species new to interstellar society, we value this exchange of knowledge." Vexler nodded to Wright. "Captain, you have the floor." Wright stood still for a moment, scanning the room. When he spoke, his voice was clear and carried throughout the chamber without shouting. "Thank you, Commander Vexler and the honored members of the Council. I understand there have been discussions about human military history, specifically about what some of you consider myths or exaggerations about our combat capabilities." Several aliens shifted in their seats. Caliph, the Phrygian scientist, made a small chirping sound. "I've been asked to explain why humans tell stories of last stands and impossible victories," Wright continued. "To do that, I need to tell you about what happened on Outpost Delta 7 during the final days of the Crawl conflict." The chamber grew quieter. The Crawl conflict was still recent enough that most species remembered the reports of the violent raiders attacking human colonies. "I was stationed on Outpost Delta 7 as security chief," Wright said. "It was a mining colony on the edge of human space. Not very important strategically, but rich in certain minerals. We had a small garrison of 38 Marines and security personnel. The civilian population was 214 people, mostly miners and their families." Wright's voice remained steady as he recounted how the first attacks came without warning. The Crawl had launched a coordinated offensive against multiple human outposts. Communications were cut off. Reinforcements would take at least 8 days to arrive if they got the distress signal at all. Our long-range sensors detected a Crawl warship entering orbit. They deployed ground forces numbering over 3,000 combat units. We were outnumbered nearly 100 to 1. A murmur ran through the alien audience. Even if the numbers were exaggerated, the situation sounded dire. "Surrender wasn't an option," Wright said simply. "The Crawl had already demonstrated what happened to human prisoners on Colony 9. We had civilians to protect, including 43 children under the age of 10. Wright described how they organized their defense, how they used the mining facility's layout to create choke points and traps, how they armed the civilians who could fight and created a secure bunker for those who couldn't. We had 8 days to hold out until potential reinforcements. Our goal was simple: protect the civilians and make the Crawl pay such a heavy price that they might withdraw." As Wright spoke, the chamber grew increasingly silent. The aliens leaned forward in their seats. Even the most skeptical representatives seemed caught up in his story. The first attack came at dawn on the second day. 200 Crawl infantry with heavy weapons. They expected a quick victory? Wright's face showed no emotion as he continued. "We had mined the main approach with explosives from the mining operation. The first wave lost 68 soldiers in the initial blast. The rest fell back in confusion. Wright described the battle in simple, factual terms. No dramatic flair or boasting. Just the reality of the fight. How each human defender was assigned. Sectors to cover. How they used the colony's maintenance tunnels to move between positions and strike where the Crawl least expected. By the end of the second day, we had lost 4 Marines but killed over 150 Crawl soldiers. They pulled back to regroup. Commander Vexler interrupted with a raised hand. "Captain, forgive me, but these numbers seem difficult to believe. How could so few defenders inflict such damage?" Wright nodded as if he expected the question. Knowledge of terrain, better cover, superior marksmanship. And most importantly, Commander, we had no choice. Every human on that outpost knew what failure meant. Wright continued his account. The Crawl changed tactics on the third day. They used their superior numbers to attack from multiple directions. At once, the human defenders were stretched thin. We lost 9 more people that day. Private Lavra Simmons was killed holding the north entrance so a group of children could be moved to a safer location. Sergeant Alan Foster died covering our retreat from the outer perimeter. Each loss hurt our defense capabilities significantly. Wright's voice never wavered, but Carter noticed his hands had tightened into fists at his sides. These weren't just soldiers to Wright. They were friends he had lost. By the 4th day, we were down to 23 combat-effective personnel. Lieutenant Patricia Miller organized the civilians who could fight. We had miners using industrial tools as weapons. Medical staff preparing stimulants to keep fighters awake. Children running messages between positions when our comm units failed. The aliens were completely silent now. Even those who had scoffed at human myths seemed disturbed by Wright's clinical description of the battle. The Crawl commander grew frustrated. He began using heavier weapons that risked damaging the mining facility they wanted to capture. They fired on civilian shelters. They used toxic gas in the lower tunnels. Wright paused. That's when we implemented Protocol Omega. What is Protocol Omega? Asked a Dovan representative. Wright looked up at the massive alien. It's a last resort tactic. When defeat seems certain, you ensure that victory costs the enemy more than they can bear. We booby-trapped bodies, we poisoned water supplies. We recorded screams and battle sounds to make our forces seem larger than they were. We made sure every Crawl who broke through our lines never came back out. Several aliens shifted uncomfortably in their seats. The Zarkonians exchanged glances. What Wright described violated several conventions of warfare that most civilized. Species observed. Captain, Commander Vexler said carefully, these tactics sound excessive. Even barbaric by galactic standards. Wright met his gaze without flinching. The Crawl were executing civilian children. Commander, we did what was necessary. His voice remained calm, but there was something in his eyes that made even the battle hardened. Vexler looked away first. Carter watched the reactions around the room. Some aliens looked disgusted, others seemed fascinated. A few nodded in grim understanding. But all of them were now paying very close attention to the human captain. None of them were dismissing his account as myth anymore. Tomorrow, Wright said, I will continue with what happened on days 5 through 8 of the siege. Unless the Council feels this information is not relevant to understanding human military doctrine. Please continue tomorrow, Captain, Commander. Vexler said quickly. The Council will reconvene at the same time. He sounded like he wasn't sure if he wanted to hear more, but couldn't stop himself from asking. As the session ended, Carter approached Wright. That was intense, the ambassador said quietly. Are you sure sharing these details is wise? Wright watched the aliens filing out of the chamber. Many were looking back at him with new expressions on their alien faces: fear, respect, confusion. They wanted to know about human warfare, Ambassador. I'm just getting started. The next day, the Security Council chamber was even more crowded than before. Word had spread about Captain Wright's testimony. Species that normally sent junior representatives to council meetings now had their senior diplomats present. Ambassador, Carter noticed several military leaders who rarely attended political functions were sitting in the front rows. Captain Wright stood at the center platform looking exactly as he had the day before. His uniform was clean and pressed. His face revealed nothing of what he might be feeling. Commander Vexler called the session to order. Captain Wright will now continue his account of the events at Outpost Delta 7 during the Crawl conflict. Captain, you may proceed. Wright nodded once. Thank you, Commander. Yesterday I described the first 4 days of the siege. By that point, we had lost over half our military personnel, but had inflicted significant casualties on the Crawl forces. On the 5th day, everything changed. The chamber grew silent as Wright continued his story. He explained how the Crawl launched their largest assault yet at dawn on the 5th day. They came from 3 directions at once using the cover of a dust storm to hide their movements. They breached the outer perimeter at multiple points. We fell back to the central mining complex. By midday, they had pushed us into the processing facility and administrative buildings. We were running out of ammunition for our standard weapons. Wright described how the human defenders adapted. The mining colony had industrial tools and chemicals that could be repurposed. Cutting torches became improvised flamethrowers. Mining explosives were turned into traps. Industrial chemicals were mixed to create toxic smoke bombs. Lieutenant Miller had worked in the chemical processing section before joining the Marines. She knew which compounds would react violently when mixed. We placed containers at key junctions in the corridors. When the Crawl broke through, we would trigger the mixtures. Wright's voice remained calm and factual, but the content of his story grew increasingly disturbing. He described close-quarters combat in narrow mining tunnels. Humans fighting with whatever they had available when ammunition ran out. Mining picks, wrenches, broken metal pipes. Private John Wilson held a junction point for 20 minutes with just a fire axe after his rifle jammed. He killed 7 Crawl soldiers before they finally overwhelmed him. His sacrifice allowed 18 civilians to escape to the lower levels. Several alien representatives shifted uncomfortably in their seats. The Zarkonians, known for their military prowess, exchanged glances. This kind of desperate fighting wasn't what they considered proper warfare. By nightfall on the 5th day, we were pushed into the lower mining levels. We had 16 fighting-capable personnel remaining and approximately 170 civilians. The Crawl had suffered hundreds of casualties but still outnumbered us by a massive margin. Wright paused and took a sip of water. The chamber remained completely silent. That night, we made a decision. The Crawl thought they had us trapped in the lower levels, but the miners knew something the Crawl didn't. There was an old emergency shaft that had been sealed off years earlier. It was dangerous and unstable, but it led to a secondary facility 2 kilometers away. We could evacuate the civilians while a small team stayed behind to convince the Crawl we were all still there. Wright described how they split their remaining forces. 10 defenders would stay behind to create the illusion that all humans remained in the main facility. 6 would escort the civilians through the dangerous tunnel system. I stayed with the defensive team. Our job was to make enough noise and resistance that the Crawl would focus all their attention on the main facility. We spread out to make our numbers seem larger. We set up speakers playing recorded gunfire and voice communications. We rigged the remaining mining explosives throughout the complex. The aliens listened with rapt attention. Even those who had been most skeptical about human military capabilities were now fully engaged in Wright's account. On the morning of the 6th day, the Crawl launched what they thought would be their final assault. They committed nearly all their remaining forces. Over 1,000 soldiers pushed into the main facility from multiple entry points. Wright described the desperate holding action. How each human defender was responsible for covering multiple positions. How they would fire from one location, then quickly move to another to give the impression of greater numbers. We knew we couldn't stop them. We just needed to hold them long enough for the civilians to reach the secondary facility. Each minute, we bought cost Crawl lives and saved human ones. Wright's voice never changed its tone, but his hands had clenched into fists again. Carter could see the tension in his shoulders as he relived these moments. By midday, we were down to 6 defenders. The crawl had pushed us back to the central processing chamber. That's when Staff Sergeant Paul Davis activated the main mining charges. Wright described how the explosives had been placed at key structural points throughout the facility. The detonation collapsed large sections of the complex, killing hundreds of crawl soldiers who had pushed inside. Sergeant Davis didn't survive the initial blast. Neither did Corporal Richard Green. The rest of us were cut off from each other in different sections of what remained of the facility. The most hardened military leaders in the chamber were now leaning forward, completely absorbed in Wright's account. The story had moved beyond a simple battle report. It had become something else, a testament to what intelligent beings would do when pushed to their absolute limits. For the next 24 hours, it was no longer a coordinated defense. Each of us fought alone, moving through the ruins, setting traps, ambushing crawl search parties, drawing them deeper into the unstable structure. Wright described how he had spent hours buried under rubble after a secondary collapse only to emerge behind crawl lines. How he had used their confusion to eliminate an entire search party with just a combat knife. How he had stolen their weapons and used them against other crawl units. By the dawn of the 7th day, I had no idea if any other defenders were still alive. I had severe injuries to my face and left arm. I was suffering from dehydration and exhaustion. But I knew that every hour I kept fighting meant the civilians had a better chance of reaching safety. Wright's hand unconsciously moved to the scar on his face. It was the first sign of emotion he had shown during his entire testimony. The crawl became increasingly desperate and frustrated. They had lost hundreds of soldiers to what they thought was a trapped and defeated enemy. Their commander ordered them to use heavier weapons despite the risk to the facility they wanted to capture. They began bombarding sections of the ruins from orbit. Several aliens gasped at this escalation. Orbital bombardment of ground targets with civilians potentially present violated multiple galactic conventions. I was preparing for my final stand when I heard something unexpected. Human voices on a military frequency. The reinforcements had arrived early. A Human Systems Alliance battle group had picked up our distress signal and pushed their engines beyond safe limits to reach us. Wright's voice remained steady, but there was a hint of pride as he described the human fleet engaging the crawl warships in orbit, while Marine drop ships deployed to the surface. The crawl were caught between our rescue forces and whatever remained of our defense. They were exhausted and demoralized after days of taking heavy losses against what they thought was a much larger enemy. Commander Vexler raised his hand. Captain Wright, you mentioned that the human civilians had evacuated. Were they recovered safely? Wright nodded. 152 civilians reached the secondary facility. 22 died during the evacuation due to tunnel collapses or injuries. The rest survived and were evacuated by the rescue forces, the aliens murmured among themselves. Even with the losses, getting so many civilians to safety against such odds seemed remarkable. Tomorrow, Wright said, I will conclude with the final day of the siege and explain what this means for understanding human warfare. He stepped back from the platform. As the session ended, Carter noticed the aliens watching Wright with very different expressions than the day before. There was fear there, yes, but also something like respect. And many seemed troubled by what they had heard. You're making quite an impression, Carter said quietly as they left the chamber. Wright looked tired. I'm just telling them what happened, Ambassador. Tomorrow they'll understand why it matters. The final day of Captain Wright's testimony drew an even larger crowd than before. The main Security Council chamber couldn't hold all the representatives who wanted to attend. The session was moved to the Grand Assembly Hall, which could seat thousands. Ambassador Carter watched as species that normally avoided each other now sat side by side, all focused on the human captain standing at the center platform. Wright looked tired today. The telling of his story seemed to be taking a toll on him. But his posture remained straight and his voice was clear as Commander Vexler called the session to order. Captain Wright will now conclude his account of the events at Outpost Delta. 7. And explain their relevance to understanding human military capabilities, Vexler announced. The commander's tone had changed over the past 2 days. The hint of condescension was gone, replaced by something like cautious respect. Wright nodded to the commander. Thank you. Yesterday I described the arrival of human reinforcements on the 7th day. What I didn't mention was that our rescue forces were massively outnumbered as well. They had diverted from their planned course and arrived with only 2 combat ships and a small contingent of Marines. The alien audience murmured in surprise. They had assumed the human reinforcements were a large battle group. The human systems. Alliance ship Defiant engaged the Crawl warship in orbit. The transport Horizon deployed Marines to the surface. They numbered just 75 combat troops against the remaining Crawl forces of approximately 900. Wright described how the Marines coordinated with the surviving defenders. They established a perimeter around the secondary facility where the civilians had taken shelter and prepared for the Crawl counterattack. Major Frank Hall was in command of the Marine unit. He found me half-conscious in the ruins of the main facility. I was the only survivor of the defensive team. The other 9 had given their lives buying time for the evacuation. For the first time in his testimony, Wright's voice wavered slightly. He paused to take a breath before continuing. Major Hall didn't hesitate. Despite being outnumbered, he split his forces. One team secured the civilians while the other launched an offensive operation against the Crawl. He knew that defense alone would fail against such numbers. Our only chance was to make the Crawl believe they faced a much larger force. Wright described how the human Marines used hit-and-run tactics against the Crawl. They would strike quickly, then fall back, drawing the alien forces into prepared kill zones. They used the ruins of the mining facility to set ambush. They employed the same psychological warfare techniques that the defenders had used in the earlier days of the siege. By the afternoon of the 8th day, something unexpected happened. The Crawl began to retreat. Not in an organized withdrawal, but in small groups breaking away from their main force. Their command structure was fracturing. The alien representatives listened intently. Many took notes. The military officers among them looked troubled by what they were hearing. In orbit, the Defiant had taken heavy damage but managed to cripple the Crawl warship's main weapons. When they saw their forces on the ground disintegrating and their ship disabled, the Crawl commander made a final desperate decision, he ordered his remaining troops to make a suicide charge against the human positions. Wright's face showed no emotion as he described the final battle. How the remaining Crawl forces, still numbering in the hundreds, launched a massive frontal assault against the human defensive line. We had 48 combat-effective personnel remaining. The Marines had set up interlocking fields of fire using salvaged weapons from fallen Crawl. We had mines along the likely approach routes. Every human who could hold a weapon was on the line, including some of the civilian miners. The chamber was completely silent as Wright continued. He described how the Crawl charged forward in waves, how the human line bent but didn't break under the assault, how each defender held their position even as those beside them fell. When it was over, 11 humans remained combat effective. 3 more would die of their injuries in the following days. The Crawl force was completely destroyed. Out of an original attacking force of over 3,000, we confirmed 2,146 Crawl casualties. A shocked murmur ran through the alien audience. Even if the numbers were somewhat exaggerated, the ratio of casualties was astounding. 2 days later, a full Human Systems Alliance battle group arrived and secured the system. The civilians were evacuated to safety. The mining colony was eventually rebuilt with improved defenses. The Crawl never attacked that sector again. Wright paused and looked around the vast chamber. Thousands of alien eyes stared back at him. Some with disbelief, others with newfound respect, many with evident unease. I've told you this story not to boast about human military prowess. The point of my testimony wasn't our victory. It's that this wasn't unique. Throughout human history, similar stands have occurred. Thermopylae wasn't myth. Neither was Rourke's Drift, or Bastogne, or 100 other last stands. Wright's voice grew stronger as he reached the core of his message. Humans don't glorify these stories because we love violence. We tell them because they reveal something fundamental about our species. The captain looked directly at Commander Vexler. When humans have no possibility of victory, when we're outnumbered and outgunned, we don't surrender. We become something else entirely. Something willing to pay any price to protect what we value. A heavy silence fell over the chamber. The implications weren't lost on the alien representatives. If a small garrison of humans could inflict such damage, what would happen if humanity itself were ever truly threatened? We don't tell these stories to frighten others, Wright continued more softly. We tell them to remind ourselves of what we're capable of, both the heroism and the horror, the price we pay when we're pushed to our limits. Ambassador Carter watched the reactions across the chamber. He could see the calculations happening behind alien eyes. The diplomatic equations were being rewritten in real time. Humanity had just moved from interesting newcomer to approach with caution in the galactic hierarchy. Thank you for your attention, Wright concluded simply. He stepped back from the platform and stood at attention. Commander Vexler seemed at a loss for words momentarily. Finally, he rose from his seat. The Council thanks Captain Wright for his testimony. This session will adjourn to allow representatives to consider what we have learned. As the aliens filed out of the chamber, many stole glances back at the human captain. Conversations had already begun in hushed tones. Carter knew that reports would be sent to every homeworld about what they had heard. Carter approached Wright as the chamber emptied. That was quite a conclusion, Captain. Wright looked tired but satisfied. They needed to understand, Ambassador. Better they learn from words than experience. As they walked toward the exit, Commander Vexler intercepted them. The tall alien looked at Wright with new eyes. Captain, I must admit that my species has misjudged yours. We thought your military history was filled with myths. Now I see we were mistaken, Wright nodded. A common error, Commander. People often confuse the unbelievable with the impossible. I believe, the alien said quietly, we have much to learn. From each other, Wright looked up at the commander. For all our sakes, Commander, I hope we learn through friendship rather than experience. Vexler bowed deeply, a sign of respect rarely shown to species new to the galactic community. As do I, Captain, as do I. As they walked back to the human section of the station, Carter looked at Wright. Do you think they'll treat us differently now? Wright smiled slightly. It was the first real smile Carter had seen from him. They'll respect our boundaries. And they'll think twice before dismissing our history as myth. Sometimes the truth is far more frightening than fiction. Carter nodded as they continued walking. The galaxy had just learned an important lesson about humanity. They weren't just another species joining the galactic community. They were something the stars hadn't seen before. A species that became most dangerous when victory seemed impossible. The aliens might scoff at human myths, but they would never again doubt the chilling truth behind them.